Okay, hello and welcome to the webinar that we're carrying out for you today called The Power of Imagination, Creativity and Play in Learning. This will be delivered by Professor Alison James, who is the Professor of Learning and Teaching at the University of Winchester. My name is Nadia Morad and I'm the project leader for the Southern Universities Network. Before we get into the webinar at all, I do just want to do a sound check because we've had a couple of little issues with sound at the moment. So if you are able to hear me and you're tuning into the webinar at the moment, could you just type yes into the comments box in front of you or the questions box that you've got? Okay, so if you're able to hear at the moment, if you can just type yes into the comments box, just so that we can be absolutely sure. Okay, fantastic. We've had a couple of messages that have just come through now, so thank you very much for doing that. Okay, so the webinar is going to be delivered by Professor Alison James, and it forms part of our Southern Universities Network, or SUN, webinar programme, which is CPD for teachers and advisors. To give just a little bit of background, the SUN is a partnership of 6 universities in the south, and it forms part of the National Collaborative Outreach Programme, which some of you who've tuned in today may well be familiar with. The central aims of the National Collaborative Outreach Programme are to increase participation and progression of young people to level 4 learning, so to higher education of any form. And our central aim is to double the proportion of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds into higher education by 2020. So this webinar programme forms part of our outreach activity in the sense that by providing professional development for staff in schools, colleges and higher education, we're hopefully able to have some impact upon progression and student experience. So that's just a very little bit of background. Just to let you know, the webinar is scheduled today to run up until 5 at the very latest, so we should be finished by 5. It is being recorded, again, just to make you aware of that. And the format for the webinar is going to be, in just a moment, I will pass over to Alison, who will be leading the webinar, and you should be able to see Alison's PowerPoint slides as she goes through in just a moment. Alison will present to you on the topic, and I will then be taking some questions at the end. So if you've got any questions as Alison presents, do just type them into the questions or comments box that you've got in front of you, the section where you just typed yes a moment ago. And then at the end, if there's questions, I will pass them on to Alison, and we'll do a very, very brief evaluation section at the end. It's just 3 very, very short multiple choice questions. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to hand over to Alison. There may be just a brief moment where the sound goes a little bit shaky or the screen goes a little bit shaky as well. So just bear with us for just a moment while we do that. Alison, just to point out quickly, you need to just, I think at the moment your sound's not coming through. So if you just click the microphone button to unmute yourself, and we should then be able to hear you fine.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, you've disappeared from the screen for a moment, but that's fine. We can see the slides.
Apologies, colleagues. I don't know why, but the microphone was stuck at muted, and the only way I've managed to unmute it was actually by turning the video off. But that might be actually a relief. So without further ado, we'll get into the talk.
Okay, thanks, Alison.
Okay. So just a little bit about me. Nadia's told you that I'm a professor of learning and teaching here. I'm a Lego serious play facilitator, hence lots of images of Lego. I'm also a cat lover. So cats and Lego, you now know pretty much all you need to know about me, really. But what I'd like to talk to you about today really is the way that play has increased in popularity and credibility in the higher education sector over the last 5 years. It's a very recent change. It's certainly not a widespread change. But one of the things that I would like to discuss with you this afternoon is our misconceptions of play, particularly with regard to complex learning, advanced learning, the place of play, particularly in a very marketized higher education sector these days, where it's all about value for money, it's all about customer experience, and a whole heap of other rather unpleasant terms that I, as an educator, really don't like at all, which doesn't mean that I don't want students to get the best possible experience while they're with us, but I do feel very uncomfortable about the direction of travel and some of the language that's being adopted. But anyway, here you have a play on the obvious Coke icon and the notion of zeitgeist. So there is a shift in the zeitgeist, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about this afternoon. But before I do, I just want to sort of share a couple of stories. So my practice is particularly rooted in higher education, but one of the things that we do at Winchester every year is we have an event called Juniversity. And this is really aimed at bringing children from disadvantaged schools and backgrounds into a university and thinking about it as a place where they belong. It's not just for the children who've gone to grammar school or come from certain catchment areas. And the pictures that you can see there are some of their 150 students who come to Juniversity over a couple of days. We do Lego serious play workshops together. We explore a chosen theme, whether it's what university means to them, whether it's growth mindset, or a whole heap of other things that I agree with the Juniversity conveners and with the teachers in preparing the session. So a massive eye-opener for me and a fantastic experience for the children who, you know, it's like coming to Hogwarts, they say, as you can see by the sort of the wooden framework at the back of the Great Hall that they do their workshop in. So, but they are coming from an educational sector where I would expect them to be used to play. They're still surprised by the fact that we use Lego, but play to me is something that is so much bound up with learning development, the movement from childhood to adolescence. And then somewhere along the way, we lose sight of that. We lose sight of play as a valuable learning tool for us as adults. And we'll talk about that in a second. But what I also want to talk about very quickly before moving on to thinking about what play means to us is a memory that I have of my own primary school education. It was a very long time ago, so it's probably not surprising if I don't remember all of it. But I do remember one very particular afternoon. I was probably 8 years old. It was a painting class. It was run by my teacher, and the headmaster came up to see how we were doing. And we were all painting in this room. And I was just getting nowhere with my painting. I tried to paint something and it didn't work out. And so I tried something else. It didn't work out. And I was just genuinely, I couldn't work out why it wasn't happening the way I wanted it to. And in the end, I thought, well, I've got so many colours on my page. How about I just blend them all into brown, and then I'll see what I can do from there. So I blended all the paint into brown. And while I was just looking at this brown paint thinking, what shall I do next? I realised I had my teacher and my headmaster standing by my table. And as a kid, you may not know why you're in trouble, but you definitely know you are. And they looked at each other and they looked at me, and their lips were pursed. And there was a lot of sighing and a bit of shaking of the heads and a walking away. They never actually spelt out to me or asked me what I was doing. But if they'd bothered, I could have said to them, I'm not being naughty, disruptive or destructive. I've just got to an impasse with my painting, except of course I didn't know what the word impasse was, aged 8. And now I'm just trying to do something else. But to me, I remember that memory of a time when I was playing and exploring, but with a serious intent, which was trying to get my painting right. And the teachers didn't get it, and they thought it was trivial, and they thought I was being disobedient. And that's really struck me. And it struck me as part of the reason, or part of the explanation why I think we sometimes misinterpret the value of play in secondary education, particularly when people move into sixth form college, and certainly in some areas of university. And it's not everybody. I hope that this afternoon's examples will show that loads of people are playing, loads of people understand how important play is for complex and advanced learning and for bringing subjects and concepts alive. But some people just feel that play is what you do outside work. So to try and give the lie to that, I just want to say a few words about the science of play. And the lady you've got at the top of the screen there, Marion Diamond, who died relatively recently, was an amazing scholar, and she was one of the first neuroscientists. She did an awful lot of work on the brain. She particularly did work on Einstein's brain, on a portion of it, after he was dead, obviously. And she did a lot of research looking at rats and social behaviour, brain size. And she worked out through this research that rats that were given toys, games and social opportunities had much greater brain capacity than the rats that weren't given those opportunities to play. And she and others were able to sort of extend that correlation into human behaviour. Stuart Brown, you've got that lovely book cover of Stuart Brown's over in the bottom right hand corner, and this was the book title that I always wish I'd come up with first. Play, how it shapes the brain, opens the imagination and invigorates the soul. You've got it in a sentence. And Brown has done a huge amount of research with disadvantaged, delinquent youths, 6,000 plus case studies. And he could see a very clear pattern that where there was play deprivation, there was likely to be a higher correlation with delinquency or sociopathic behaviour. He also was very interested in Marion Diamond's work. He's very interested in the work of animal behaviourists and other people who have also come to the realization that the more you play, the greater your brain size. Brown also argues that humans are neotenous, and by that he means that we import characteristics of our juvenile behavior into adult life. And that's part of how we keep our brains elastic and flexible. We stay curious and interested in learning as we get older. And I guess it's also something that keeps us youthful to a certain extent. So there's a physiological reason why play actually changes the way our brains function and the size of the brain. Certainly, if you look at brain function, the creation of new synapses and connections through play, that's all about how we keep ourselves alive, vibrant, open, and able to start seeing new possibilities and new interpretations and have new ideas and greater understanding and build connection, all of which are elements of complex and important learning. So there you are, you've got a bit of the science of play, and then we get into talking about definitions, types and perceptions of play, and this is where we get into quite variegated territory. So I'm going to be looking at a range of play theorists, very much a kind of helicopter view, but these are people who have been very important in shaping my understanding on play. So we've got Stuart Brown again, and I strongly recommend his TED talk on play that you can find very easily. Just Google Stuart Brown and play, and you'll have 26 minutes of wonderfully informed discussion of play and his own research and practice. So he talks about play being fun and without predetermined purpose. Now that's already a bit of a challenge in a university, and perhaps it is in schools and in sixth form colleges as well, because we really like our predetermined purposes. We like our learning outcomes. We like to know where we're headed. We like to be able to say to our senior managers and so forth that there is a reason to why we're doing things. So that's one argument about play, but I think that's the one that we lose sight of, is we're not so brave about saying, have fun, use play, see what happens, because I think we're worried that it's about wasting time. We also have those very real constraints on us about resource capacity, class size, getting through the syllabus, etc., etc. But that's one view. Brian Sutton-Smith, another play theoretician who was certainly quite interested in the kind of darker side of play. It's not all bunnies and unicorns. But Sutton-Smith talks about how play comes into more Machiavellian relationships, the darker sides of the ways that we interact and manipulate each other. Now, he was one of many people who have looked at all the different types of play and thought, can we actually come up with a typology? Can we list all the different kinds of play, categorize them? And he certainly had a go at categorizing them. But my goodness, there were so many. And pastimes, recreation, entertainments and hobbies are just a few. But there's an almost limitless set, and he's not alone in believing that it's quite hard to come up with a sort of comprehensive and finite categorization of play. Johann Huizinga in the 1930s was writing about play as a cultural phenomenon. He was even saying play is pre-cultural. Animals can do it without us having to teach them to do it. It's something natural. So already you have a different kind of take on play. Then you've got Pat Kane. Now, he used to be a singer. He was in the pop duo Hue and Cry back in the 80s, if anybody's as old as me and can remember them. And Kane wrote this fantastic book called The Play Manifesto, or rather The Play Ethic. And it was a social manifesto for really arguing that somehow some parts of our Western society have become inculcated into a work ethic. We, you know, the harder you work, the more valuable you are as a citizen, etc., etc. But he says, actually, that's just an arbitrary choice about how we've organized ourselves. What if we were organized by a play ethic? And by that, he doesn't mean just sitting on our bottoms and messing around and generally being useless. He's talking about having a totally different kind of attitude to human existence and a different set of values. He also talks about again, differentiating and extending our understandings of what play means. You know, for him, play is not about being idle or being distracted from the proper real life sensible stuff. It's about taking reality lightly. And all you need to think about is the gallows humor of doctors, theatre surgeons, policemen, firemen, and anybody else, or sometimes, you know, office banter, if we want to call it that. It's about how we cope with changes, challenges, things out of our control, the stuff that we're having to deal with on a daily basis. All you have to do is go on Twitter and look at Brexit jokes to know exactly what taking reality looks like when you're taking it lightly. Bob Fagan, animal behaviourist, again backs up Sutton-Smith, saying there's too many types of play. So it doesn't really matter to me about too many types of play. I think it's really important to remember this as a guiding rule. But what we need to think about as educators is, okay, there are all these different types of play, but what is right for me, for my subject, for my learners, for this context at this point in time? And we may change our minds. We may be quite flexible in our interpretation. Mcmanus talks about play or playfulness, not what we do necessarily, but how we do it. And that's really important too, because sometimes we will have something that is not a playful topic in itself, but it's how we handle it. Statistics, law, I don't know. I'm just chucking subjects out there. You might feel they are hugely playful. But anyway, so there we are, definitions, types. And if we were together in a room, we'd probably have a chat at this point about what you think play is, where you think you play, what are the kinds of play that you like, what are the kinds of play that you can't stand, that don't do it for you. And then we would get on to think about what is play for in a learning context. So again, you've got a selection of theorists here, and I know you can read this slide. I've already talked about Huizinga and the kind of pre-cultural side of things. Brown, he sees play as essential to combating deviancy, but also for developing in a healthy way and for being socialized. Plato was one who argued that actually you learnt more about somebody in an hour of play than you did in a year of conversation. And then you've got somebody, you've got the view that if you want to understand play, then you need to do a lot of play. You need to really engage in it. And for Pat Kane again, play is a generator of originality, growth and new development. Well, that is exactly what we want to see in our students, whether they're higher education students, postdoctoral researchers, primary students, secondary students, college students, wherever, or us as we learn in informal settings. That's what we want to get to grips with too, to keep ourselves learning and developing. So, thinking about enhancing learning through play, and this is just something that I wanted to kind of point you towards. I can't play you the TED talk, but I heard Mara Mintzer talking the other morning on a podcast, and this was interesting because she was taking the example of an initiative she set up in Boulder, Colorado, and that was, she said, when we design, when we're urban planners, she's an urban planner, we leave out a really large proportion of our citizens in that design process. We consult adults, but we don't consult children when we are coming to design our learning spaces, our social spaces, our city spaces. And so she was talking about something that she set up where she brought together children and urban planners to start thinking about how to redevelop spaces in Boulder. And it's a fantastic podcast. I won't say much more about it, but it certainly was brilliant to see how children adopted a very playful approach to the redesign of those spaces, but actually they found that play spaces designed by children were good for everyone, whether it's about how you navigated the space, what you could do in the space. They would quite happily think of getting aesthetic or joyful elements into the space that maybe us who are a lot older would come up with much more functional elements. So I recommend it. You can find it on TEDx Mile High. It's on Spotify if you've got it. You can certainly Google it and just find the talk. You can watch it on YouTube as well. So I recommend you have a look at that in terms of the contribution to what we consider, grown-up jobs that children bring. And she uses this lovely phrase about grown-ups and growing-ups, which I think we've also heard adopted by the whole PUDSI children in need thing as well. So just a quick thought there about that. Now, this is just a quick word on some of the work that I've been doing. I mentioned I'm a Lego Serious Play facilitator. So I do a lot of work with children of any age. You saw the university slide, so it might be primary school children. But I also work with adults, corporate educational settings, not-for-profit, social, looking at exploring complex practices, complex issues, dilemmas, problems through the medium of Lego, through the methodology Lego Serious Play. And there's a publication I did for the Higher Education Academy with some case studies taken from the creative arts. Now, again, this is a methodological approach which is very systematic. It's metaphorical. You build things, you share them, you add to your buildings. And there is a Lego education variant for schools which has the 4 C's, which are around contemplation, construction, connection, and creation. I can never always remember the 4 C's, but but that's you get the drift. So it is about how these playful methodologies are being brought into learning contexts at every age. And in fact, just this week I was in Manchester with doctoral students. The week before I was in Dundee looking at exploring co-design with people from the new V&A Dundee, but also with educators from a range of universities as well. And co-design is something that Mara Mintzer talks about when she's talking about her Boulder, Colorado initiative. That's exactly what they're doing. So it's about play as a participatory, as a social learning strategy that crosses all age boundaries. I've also just, I wrote 4 years ago a book with Stephen Brookfield, which touches on play, engaging imagination. With Christina Rancy, we also did a magazine called Exploring Play in Higher Education, which imported some of the playful stories that colleagues shared with us from 37 different locations. And Chrissy and I have built on that work and now have this book, Power of Play in Higher Education, coming out in January, which is looking at the work from 42 contributors from UK, USA, Europe, all looking at how they have brought play into mathematics, into engineering, into science, into literature, a whole heap of locations. All of that was not a shameless plug for stuff I've written, but it was really just to point you towards the kind of the evidence and the materials that we are starting to accumulate, some by me and some by lots of other people, that make that argument for play. So if we look at some of the examples that colleagues have shared with me over time, when I was in the States a couple of years ago, giving some talks on play on the East and on the West Coast, I met an amazing guy who was a head of a learning and teaching centre, but he'd been a dolphin trainer. Now, in his grown-up life, he was a behavioural psychologist, but he'd taken training techniques from working with dolphins in conservation and he had incorporated them into behavioural psychology. And that absolutely blew me away, because to me, that was by taking play from one context and making it incredibly useful, meaningful, entertaining and engaging in another. Won't surprise you, because I'm sure you use loads of games of all descriptions, particularly board games, in lots of places. Wardopoly is about nursing. Park life is about wildlife conservation concepts. There's lots of outdoorsy activity, whether it's building rafts as teams or learning about your leadership style through sheepdog handling, or actually going on different kinds of outdoor explorations. So at the University of Kent, they've got the Creative Campus Initiative. They've got their own outdoor seminar space. They've got a labyrinth, which is in a meadow that people can use from lots of different disciplines. And that's about play, but it's also about contemplation, reflection on learning. Maths, if you look at the work of Chris Budd at Bath, he's somebody who likes showing patterns and the artistry in mathematics, and he does it through magic and play. Other people use juggling. Other people have explored conceptions of space. By other people, I don't know why I'm saying other people, it's me and one other guy. But we were working with museum curators, and they were postgrads, but we gave them all white Lego bricks, and we were getting them to explore what their thinking around space, use of space in general, but also in a museum curation context was all about. Then you find people wanting to bring fantastical objects or things that are different or engaging or exciting or a bit exotic into all sorts of classrooms. So cabinets of curiosities, if you've ever been to places like the Wellcome Centre near Euston, or if you've been to other museums where people have just got these crazy things in cupboards just because they are useful and interesting, and increasingly people bring those into their subject teaching, whether it happens to be cultural studies, which is quite an obvious connection, particularly material culture fashion, or whether it's about communication and presentation and bringing culture shoebox into dental education. That one always makes me smile, because I think it's really important about that, what looks like a crazy mismatch, but actually is that kind of jarring juxtaposition and making people think in very different ways about their subject. So loads and loads of examples of playful practices. And Stephen Mcmanus, I had a quote from him on one of my earlier slides, but I didn't refer to it. And he talks about free play sloshing against the sort of boundaries of our, he doesn't use these words, but the organised structures within which we have to deliver, if I can use that horrible word, our teaching and learning. And he talks about the free play sloshing against those boundaries, which I think is just a wonderful reminder that we need both. We need that setting free and we need structure. But he takes he's a musician, and so he talks a lot in his book Free Play. He writes about improvisation and how he as a musician approaches playing with music, playing with what sounds might be like, playing with his instruments, playing with the unknown. And he asks, where does the play of imagination come from? When are sounds music? When are patterns and colours art? When are words literature? And when is instruction teaching? And I love that kind of thought-provoking messing with those boundaries, because I think that it's really important for us to remember that, especially when we start making artificial separations between learning and teaching, or formal and informal, or play and work, or whatever. He also says, I never say I work in the music business. He says I'm in the surrender business, which is about giving yourself up to the experience of the subject. And I love that as a kind of rebellion against some of the strictures that we all can experience. This was just really a view from the top of a hotel tower in San Francisco. I was co-delivering a play workshop there back in February, and that was a really interesting experience. I brought brown bags with sort of tasks and toys and exploratory things to do. There was Lego, there were drawing, there was pair work, and I did genuinely wonder, was I actually going to freak out my American colleagues? Would anybody even turn up? Because my session was on a Saturday morning. But 150 people turned up for a workshop at 8:30 in the morning, and they were fantastic participants, but I also got to talk to so many of them and found that there are these wonderful approaches to learning at all ages in different parts of the US sector. And I met a vice principal of a school called Paideia in Atlanta. And at Paideia, okay, it's private, they can do what they want. But at Paideia, they don't assess any of their students before the age of 14. It is about a parent, community, child, teacher relationship. It is about the outdoors. It's about the rounded individual. And to me, that was just incredibly inspiring. And thinking of the outdoors, this is something that I'm increasingly inspired by in my own teaching and learning practices, whether it's learning for myself or supporting colleagues. And the sky that you can see here is the sky that we saw when we went to Forest School in April earlier this year. So this is Forest School in Chichester. Typically, teacher trainers and educators at Chichester bring school children to Forest School. Maybe it's once a week for a term, maybe it's a different kind of arrangement. And so the children do their usual lessons, but they do it outside. And so a bunch of us as educators went there to have our network meeting, which was actually all around accreditation and recognition, but we had it outside, and we interspersed our normal business, which we would normally be doing in a boardroom or a classroom or something, with Forest School activities. So we did creative things, we did imaginative things, we made our drinks in a billy can over a campfire, we cooked our food over the campfire, we made popcorn, that's the popcorn getting ready to sizzle, and the silver things are actually bananas and chocolate roasting. We made ink, and then we actually wrote about our thoughts about Forest School using quills that we'd sourced from fallen, not fallen birds, but certainly bird feathers. And it was just the sensation of playing while also combining it with serious work and doing it in a different location was one of the most powerful and inspiring and engaging and motivating experience I've had in higher education away days in a long time. I do want to leave time for questions, but I do want to talk a little bit about the Play and Creativity Festival. So this is something that's in its third year at Winchester, and a group of us set it up 2 years ago, really because we wanted to remind ourselves that we are a playful institution. Certainly when you think of the battering that education at all its levels is taking in the UK at the moment, we felt it was about time that we kind of reminded ourselves that we are creative, imaginative, inspired beings, that we are a great community, that we have something to be proud of and sing about, and that we can share our practices and show each other what we're doing in terms of play. So these were our aims in putting the festival on. It was a huge gamble. We ran it for a week. I think people looked at us very strangely to start with, thinking, what on earth are they on about? And also, play, isn't that wasting our time? We're all so busy. Shouldn't we be doing other things? And in fact, we ended up having 65 timetabled sessions, 350 participants. Everybody got involved, from the Vice-Chancellor to the porters, academics, students, visitors. And it was such a success. We did things across the disciplines, from learning 18th century hand gestures as an approach to drama, or watching our forensic scientist colleagues doing maggot racing, or breaking codes with a literature professor looking at the work of Sherlock Holmes. And we found just countless examples of the ways play is bringing alive higher education learning for our students, but also for us as learner practitioners, as educators, as well as specialists in our fields. Some of the pictures that you've got in this slide are of the 2018 festival, where we had a big boost to bring in more music, bring in more students. We set up a play tent down on one of our car park lawns. And the big pictures you see being painted there were actually collaborative artworks that we created over a week. Again, with multiple authors. Everybody who came in was invited to add their mark in some way to the paintings. And the paintings were all around our 3 university values of individuals matter, spirituality, and compassion. Now we've got blindfold drawing, sensory drawing up in the top right-hand corner. And again, you've got administrators, you've got the VC, you've got students, everybody pitching in and being a part of this playful community together. And so here we are, and we're getting ready for year 3. We've spread out across campus. Last year, this was student designed playful activities and games. And on the right, this is our colleague Curie Scott from Bournemouth, who came to do reflective origami with us. So increasingly, we're having people from other universities saying to us, we want to come and play at your house. We want to come and see what you do. We've even had people from Korea say to our VC, we'll send a delegation. That terrified me the first year because it was such an experiment. And I say this not disrespectfully at all, but it was quite a relief when they actually couldn't come, because I did really rather want to know, was it going to work before we actually ran it. So anyway, we're in year 3. So this is something that is taking a hold of us as an institution. And this was part of the play tent when we had a Lego workshop. In fact, we had all sorts of organised activities, but then we also found it was much better just to say to people, why don't you bring your class down to the tent? We've got all this stuff. Bring the class that you were going to do. Just do it in a different way. And people did. They came down with all their students. They sat on the beanbags. They did whatever they were going to do, but they just did it in a surprising environment. And students really commented on what that felt like for them, and so did staff. So really, just very quickly to wrap up, I'm going to share some thoughts out of those 2 festivals that showed how people's mindsets shifted from being a bit kind of iffy about play. Was this a waste of money? Was this us not doing due diligence or our due duties? And one of our professional services colleagues said this: I see the reasoning behind your team's endeavours. Play is accepted as something which is only done as or with a child. It seems as though as people age, they forget that play is a valuable learning tool, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we want to make people get past, and to realise that it's absolutely crucial. This, to me, I've had conversations with people I never speak to on subjects I never talk about. To me, you don't need any other reason to play. If you're doing this already, you are building bridges, you are learning, you are making connections, you are talking about stuff that's important. You're getting out of your silos. That was just one of my favourite reasons ever. And our Chancellor, Alan Titchmarsh, was kind enough to support the festival, and he's going to be doing a session for us next year as well. And he totally got it. He totally understood. He did a little video for us in which he said, I've been playing in my professional career for I don't know how long. And it's absolutely true. He brings a bit of what people sneeringly call edutainment to his work in terms of gardening and the outdoors. But it's actually really serious stuff. You're learning super scientific, important stuff as well as the rest of it. And so we found even people reporting that when they brought play into their history classroom or their classics classroom, that actually had knock-on effects. Students were engaged, they attended better, they retained material, therefore they performed better in exams. Who knew? And this notion that you get away from hierarchy. If you are all playing together, it is a leveller. You are all equal, irrespective of your role within the institution, and you all have something to contribute. And this was just me when I was up in Dundee a couple of weeks ago. I was struck by how playful Dundee as a city was. So you've got Desperate Dan, Minnie the Minx, Dennis the Menace, incorporated. They were created in Dundee because DC Thompson, the publishing house, was based there. The council renamed their street after the Bash Street Kids. The Mcmanus Victorian Museum, beautiful Victorian Museum and Art Gallery, had a Beano exhibition and gave itself a big new name and called itself the Mcmanus for the duration of the exhibition. And again, it's those sorts of things where cities come alive and they play. So we are learning in our social environments as well as our educational environments. So that's a bit of a canter through some thoughts about the science of play, the practices of play, and I hope you've had a chance to send some questions or some thoughts to Nadia, and I hope you've heard this all right. Just joining me, and over to you now for anything that I can pick up on and perhaps respond to in the final 15 minutes of our time together.
Okay, thank you so much, Alison, for such a fascinating webinar on a really, really interesting topic. As Alison said, if there are any questions at all that anybody wants to ask Alison now, please do in the next minute or so. If you can just type them into the questions box that you've got in front of you, I will take a pause just for a moment to see if any questions come through. If you don't have any questions, if you can just hold on for a moment so that we can see if any come through, because we have got a very, very brief evaluation question that we would just like you to complete at the end. Okay, at the moment, no questions come through. Hopefully that's a really good sign and shows that Alison has presented on the topic in as much detail as possible. If any questions, we are still here for a little while longer, so if any questions do occur to anybody, do in the next moment or two, do just type them into the question box. In the meantime, if we can just put up 3 very short questions, one after the other, sort of multiple choice evaluation questions. If you can just answer. Yes, go ahead.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I just thought, if I could just say, before you get into the evaluation, my email and my Twitter are on the screen. It's just people may not have questions now, but if afterwards people do want to get in touch with me, ask questions or raise stuff or share stuff, I'm very happy for that to happen, so please do.
Okay, thank you very much, Alison. A question, actually, as you were saying, that has just come through, very timely. So we have got a question come through from Tina, who's asking, is metaphor an important part of the play pedagogy? Is it integral or is it a separate learning tool? So Alison, if you want to address that question, just let me know if you need me to read it out to you again.
I think I got it, but if I don't answer all of it, then please prompt me. It's a very interesting question. I mean, certainly I would say metaphor does figure in a lot of play and creativity, because often we're creating something. If we're in the sort of the playful making and sticking mode, then we may well be creating things to symbolize or represent or be an analogy for something. So certainly in something like Lego serious play, yes, metaphor is very important. Is metaphor important for all types of play? I don't think so necessarily, but that there's probably a whole PhD in there. So it's one to sort of dig around in. Are you always playful when you're metaphorical? Not necessarily, I would think. If we think about the way metaphor creeps into daily language, and we don't even know we're being metaphorical when we use phrases like "I'm stuck" or "he's doing my head in" or whatever, we might be playing a little bit with language, but I think we kind of take it for granted as just a sort of a more rudimentary way of communicating. Is metaphor an important part of playful pedagogy? I think it's very handy. I think it's one tool among many. I think playful pedagogy, just as we saw that play can take so many different formats, playful pedagogies can take so many formats as well. So I think it's in there, but it's not the only thing.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Alison. And thank you very much for the question as well, Tina. Okay, so I am going to just put the evaluation questions up on the screen. They should come up for you in just a moment, if you just bear with me. And then if you can answer them as honestly as you can, that would be great. Okay, I do apologise. Something has gone really strange with the evaluation section on the screen. Unfortunately, Alison and I are having a bit of a funny situation with the tech today, so I'm not going to linger on that. You have been really great in terms of questions and attending the webinar in a busy evening as well. So I will see if there's any way of sending it out as a follow-up. Please do look out for an email, as we may well try to do it that way. But unfortunately, at the moment, the evaluation poll is refusing to load, unfortunately. So hopefully that was a useful webinar for you. If you have got any feedback at all, positive, negative, questions, anything of that nature, do feel free just to type it into the questions box anyway. If there was anything, for instance, that you found particularly helpful, or anything that you think you'll take away and use in your current practice, do feel free just to drop us a line in the questions box, and that will be really useful feedback for us. But I do apologise, the standard poll for evaluation won't seem to load. Okay, we will hang around for a moment just to see if any feedback does come up, as I said a moment ago. Otherwise, I'd like to say again to Alison, thank you so much for such an interesting webinar. And if you have kind of taken everything that you need from it and made a note perhaps of Alison's email address from the screen, do feel free just to kind of close the browser for yourself. And again, thank you so much for tuning in.
And thank you very much for having me. Are you still there, Nadia?